Hi, my name is Karen Berlin, and I am with you to share some information on autism spectrum disorders in multi-tiered systems of supports. I work at the Training and Technical Assistance Center at George Mason University and provide training and technical assistance to school personnel who are providing education for students with autism, as well as serving as a VTSS coach in Virginia. Welcome to this webinar, and I hope that you find that you know some things you didn't know before we started. So let's get started. Before I go into the content, I just want to make you aware that all of the information that I'm presenting comes from a wealth of research across our country and even internationally. But all of these logos represent the sources of information that provide evidence-based practices for students with autism and resources and information on multi-tiered systems of supports. So this might be something you want to come back to if you want to learn more information. So what are we going to do today? The main goal of this webinar is for those of you watching to consider what evidence-based practices for ASD are available and how they fit into Virginia tiered systems of supports. The reason for this is that VTSS is becoming the way of work in Virginia, and if our goal is to have our students have access to all of the learning opportunities possible, we want to be familiar with this way of work and understand how our students fit into that framework. So let's think about this for a minute. When you hear VTSS, what do you already know? What would you like to know? And at the end, I'm going to ask you what you've learned. Hopefully VTSS isn't a brand new acronym, but one that you may have heard a little bit about. Maybe when you hear it, you think of something that, VTSS, I think it's a tiered framework. Maybe it's a little bit like RTI. I heard about a tiered framework with RTI, or they talk about a tiered framework in PBIS. So maybe I've got a little bit of background about it. But what do I really want to know? The reason I'm watching this webinar is what does it have to do with autism spectrum disorders? And is it really anything new, or is it just new jargon for things that we've already been doing? So, and you might have other questions. So take a minute to think about what it is that you want to learn, and hopefully I'll cover it. If not, at the end, there'll be information about posting questions on a web board, and I'd be happy to get back to you to answer your questions. So what is the vision of VTSS? VTSS came into being because nationally multi-tiered systems of supports were the way that school divisions and individual schools were organizing their efforts to provide every student what they need. The idea was to build capacity for sustained tiered systems for academic, social, and behavioral supports that are responsive to the needs of all students in their preparation to become contributing citizens in a global society. That's Virginia's vision for VTSS. So when we say VTSS, we're talking about Virginia tiered systems of supports. The key word that I want you to note in that slide is the word all, because all means all, and that means students with autism spectrum disorders too. So the question I'd like us to think about is why integrate systems? For a long time in education, we have worked in a silo fashion where special education did its work and general education did its work. There are benefits to doing things separately in that things can become more specialized and people can become somewhat hyper-focused in their efforts. But what would be the benefit to integrating? You probably have some reasons, and I want to share some with you too. The reason we think about integrating systems is we have different ways of work that rely on some of the same components. We think about data-informed decision-making, which is a key component in PBIS and in RTI, and certainly in the approach that we take to educating students with autism. We are thinking about building a social culture that is for all students, that promotes academic and behavioral success. Those are things that we really care about for our students with autism as well. And we're focusing on an effective learning environment for everyone. So when we think about integrating, it seems like it might be more efficient and effective if all of the people working towards these ends did that work together, that we weren't redundant, that we weren't duplicating efforts, but that we were becoming effective and efficient in our work. If we do this together, then we can be in a process of continuous improvement for everyone. So when we take a look at this slide, this is really what we're talking about for Virginia Tiered Systems of Supports. It's a way of work that designs systems to support all students. When we think about a tiered system of support, we are thinking about the basic three-tier model. The three-tiered model is everywhere. You can turn over a box of flea medicine for your dog and you'll see the three-tiered framework, because it makes sense that whatever we're talking about, that there's a framework where there are some things that are good for all, there are some things that are good for some, and there are some things that are good for a few. And that's basically what we're talking about. So when we think about Tier 1, core universal supports, that's the bottom layer. When we think about tiered systems of supports, I invite you to think about it as layers of a wedding cake. It's not one or the other, but it's one and the other, and perhaps the other as well. So when we talk about core universal supports, that means 100% of the students have access to what's available in this tier. And we layer on that for those students who might need something more. So when we talk about the core, we're talking about those well-researched, evidence-based practices that produce good outcomes for the majority of students. So we want to know, what does effective instruction look like in the core? What does effective reading instruction look like? What does effective math instruction look like? What does effective behavior instruction look like? And what does effective instruction for students with disabilities look like? When we have those things in place with fidelity, then the way that we do them should have high impact for at least 80% of the students. If those core practices are in place with fidelity, then about 80% of the students should be meeting benchmarks. So the questions that we have to ask when we're thinking about Tier 1 supports are, what do we expect all students to learn? How will we know when students have learned the core curriculum? How will we respond when some students aren't successful? And how will we respond when some students have already demonstrated success with the curriculum? So the core is the main curriculum for all students, and we want to make sure that it's accessible to all students. When we think about Tier 2, remember, we still have everything in that core in place. That's still our foundation. But even with all those good practices, and when they're implemented with fidelity, we will have some students, possibly around 20%, that need something more, that even with that good core instruction, they didn't quite meet benchmarks and they need some extra support. If we're doing things well and we hit that 80%, then when we look at our advanced tiers, we're thinking about having specialized supports for about 20% of our students. So you'll see what we layer on is a smaller tier. When we're doing Tier 2 supports well, then again, we're going to expect that whatever those practices are that we're putting in place are going to reach about 70 to 80% of this smaller group of students. So remember, they're getting what's in Tier 1, we're adding on these extra supports, and we keep up with all that same progress monitoring. We might progress monitor more intensely and more frequently to be sure that we are informed of their progress, and we can change things as we need to. Finally, if we do all of that well, if we have Tier 1 in place, good core instruction with fidelity, we've done our specialized extra supports at Tier 2, then even with that, we know from our research there's still going to be 1 to 5% of the students who need really intensive supports, who even with those extra supports at Tier 2, maybe small group instruction, alternative instruction, some extra dosages of instruction, they're going to need some highly individualized support. And again, if we do our Tier 3 practice as well, we should again reach about 78 to 80% of the students that we would be serving with Tier 3 interventions. So, what does this mean? It means that if we do the right things, if we use evidence-based practices, and we implement them with fidelity, and we take a tiered approach, we can hope that all students are going to meet benchmarks. So what that means is, take a look at all these students, and remember, all means all. So take a look at a few of those little stick figures, and you can pick which ones are your students with ASD. But if we have all students and we provide tiered interventions of support, interventions that match student needs, then we can be assured that all students meet benchmarks. So that's basically what tiered systems of supports are. What we need to think about is when we discuss our interventions, the language that we use. So if you take a look at this slide, remember that all of us are individuals and we all have different needs. So this is an example of who might be a student, and in social studies, this student doesn't need any support at all. The students in the class is meeting benchmarks just as the curriculum is offered. This student is great at basketball, doesn't need any specialized coaching, doesn't need any extra supports. Basketball is probably something that defines this student as a strength for him. Reading, this student might need some Tier 2 supports in reading. Maybe Tier 2 might just be an increase in intensity or dosage, maybe a little extra small group reading. But social skills, this student is right there, doesn't need any specialized support or additional or intensive training because social skills are great. When we look at science, this student is struggling in science. Student might need a one-on-one in learning some of the components of the curriculum. Student might need a different curriculum for the science in order to be able to learn it. And math. This student is way at the top of the tiers in math and really needs some individualized support, very tailored to his needs. Spanish, Tier 2. Maybe a tutor once a week to review some of the information or a peer learning group. So the reason I give you this example is we don't talk about tiered students. We don't have Tier 1 students or Tier 2 students or Tier 3 students. We have tiered interventions. This distinction is important when we talk about students with ASD because often we might conclude that students with ASD are Tier 3 students because often they have an individualized support plan. But we need to keep in mind with our students that we label the behavior and the interventions, not people. Okay. So I want you to think for a minute, if you were riding the elevator with me, what would be your 2-minute summary of what is VTSS? Because as someone who works with students with autism, we need to be fluent in our ability to talk about things that are common language to other people. So from the slides that we've covered, what would you name are some important components of VTSS? I'll give you just a minute to think. Here's your answer. When you talk about Virginia tiered systems of support, We want to remember that it's an integrated framework. And the reason that's important for those of us supporting students with autism is it covers all the things that are important to us: social, behavior, academic, and communication. It's an entire comprehensive framework. So when we think about integrated, it's important that we understand this way of work is looking at everything comprehensively and simultaneously, not separately. We're looking at building those social and cultural supports for student success, which we're really excited about, the way of work that includes social curriculum and social teaching and behavioral supports. And the thing that appeals to us most about VTSS is it's a framework that is designed for all students. The thing that we can also celebrate about VTSS is it relies on evidence-based practices and consistent progress monitoring. And that is the way of work for our approach to education with students with autism spectrum disorders. We've spent a lot of time identifying what are those evidence-based practices, and we know what works, and when we use it, we want to do it with fidelity. So this is a good match for the way we've been doing work, and it's a good entry point for us to be a part of the broader way of work within our schools and school divisions, so that rather than things having to be so separate or specialized for students with autism, we can be a part of what everyone is doing. So what makes a tiered system work with fidelity? These 6 critical components are what define the way of work for VTSS. So one important component is data-informed decision-making. I've mentioned evidence-based practices. The importance of ongoing progress monitoring, so that's your data collection in the ASD world. Aligned organizational structure and culture. This alignment piece is really important because it helps us fit in with everything else that is going on in a school or a school division. Family, social, and community partnerships. We've learned, and the research reveals, that we have to be inclusive and be partners with all aspects that affect a student's life and not approach school in a silo fashion. And finally, evaluation. A critical component is to keep asking the question, is what we are doing working? We can do a lot of stuff and we can work really hard, but the most important question is it working? So I'm going to give you a little quiz to see what you can remember, because as you begin to think about VTSS and how you could be a part of it, you want to become familiar with these critical components. So the elements of the tiered system exist at the division, school, and classroom level and are compatible. What would that be? You got it. That's an aligned organizational structure. Just as with our practices with ASD, we have to have things working in a system where the way of learning and the way of work is the same in the classroom, in the school, and in the division. So if we are thinking about an evidence-based practice such as visual supports, we want that to be something that is aligned across all environments that the student might find him or herself. All right, ready for the next one? Aligned organizational structure is critical. What else? Data is used by teams to analyze and evaluate information related to planning and evaluating effective instructional strategies matched to student need. This isn't anything new. I hope that what you're finding is, as we're going through this, you're already doing a lot of what is VTSS. We have to use our data to inform our decisions. We have to be looking at the data to constantly be asking, is what we're doing working? Is the intervention that we've planned having success? Is it matching the student's needs? And if not, do we need to select something different or change a part of the intervention? So far, aligned organizational structure, data-informed decision-making, nothing new. Hope you're feeling confident about VTSS. All right, what was the third one? Teaching and learning approaches that are proven to be effective through scientifically based studies, which are used to guide educational decisions to ensure improved outcomes for students. You know this because what do we talk about all the time in the world of ASD? Evidence-based practices. We are only going to use evidence-based practices, and we use those things that we know that work. So again, this shouldn't feel like new territory. You should be feeling like, wow, the rest of the world has figured out what we've known in ASD for a long time. Fourth component, the collaboration of families, schools, and communities as active partners in improving learner, classroom, school division, and state outcomes. Absolutely, we have to have those family, school, and community partnerships. And we know for our students with ASD that this is an essential component because generalization is so critical for our students' success. So we need students to be able to show the skills they learn in the classroom, in the community, and other places that they go. So this link is something that we've been focused on for a long time and is becoming the way of work for all educators. So again, I hope you're feeling confident because none of this should be too new to you. It's more the way that it's now put together and packaged as a way of work. Student performance is examined frequently over time to evaluate response to instruction and intervention. We are used to constant maintenance, monitoring of student progress, and we use our data to inform us whether students are succeeding or not, if we need to change instruction or not. So ongoing progress monitoring is another key component to VTSS. One of the reasons I'm going over these is you can see how you can be a resource and a well-respected contributing member in your school division, because a lot of this is the way of work that you have already been doing. And finally, the last component is looking at fidelity, looking at is the way that we're doing these evidence-based practices correct? Is it being implemented with fidelity? And we're looking to see if we need to change anything. The results from that evaluation inform our action steps. So evaluation of the process is ongoing for continuous improvement. So with all that information of what is VTSS, you should be saying, well, that's nothing new. That's what I've been doing for a long time. So what does that have to do with the work that you do with your students with autism? Well, let's think about this. When the three-circle logic of VTSS has these three key components. The inner circles, systems, data, and practices, result in the bigger circle which says outcomes. So the way of work is supporting staff behavior, supporting student behavior, and supporting decision making. So where do you come in is thinking about what practices need to be in place, what systems need to be in place to assure those practices can be accessed and used and evidenced, and what data are you going to use to reveal how effective they are and what you're using. So now, think again for your elevator speech. And this three-circle logic that I just shared is data, systems, and practices. If you think about it somewhat like a three-legged stool, if you have one leg missing, the whole thing falls down. So think for yourself, why would systems, data, and practices all be essential for what we would want to do? Now that we've got that, we've thought about what is a three-tiered framework, what are the essential components of VTSS, those 6 components, and what are the essential elements of data, systems, and practices. We're now all experts, and we want to answer this critical question. So that's all great. That sounded like good information. But how does special education, particularly learners with autism spectrum disorders, fit into this VTSS framework? As I mentioned earlier, it's often tempting to think of students in special education in that very top tier, or even have a misunderstanding that there was a fourth tier somewhere else, that as students went through the 3 tiers, then they went off to special education land. The reality is that special education crosses all 3 tiers. That in Tier 1, specially designed instruction might simply be the accommodations or the material adaptations that make that content accessible for learners. Special education in Tier 2 might be an alternative curriculum to meet the same benchmarks. But special education is not separate, it's within the 3-tiered framework. So what do you think the answer to that question would be? Where do students with autism fit in a multi-tiered framework? For too long, our assumption has been that autism meant Tier 3 supports. And so that meant intensive. And we've supplied intensive support, sometimes a one-on-one assignment of personnel to support that student because their needs are so intense. But when we really look at what that person is doing, it could be that they're providing a Tier 1 support, something like a schedule or something like a prompt or using Post-it note reminders, which is not an extremely intensive intervention. So part of what we want to think about in the evidence-based practices that we use is how could we categorize them so that we could work within this same model, that we would have common language and a communication plan that was integrated with VTSS so that we could all be pursuing the same outcomes. When we think about what are the outcomes that we're looking at, in the box up to your left, you'll see something that talks about a resource map. The resource map is where you list out all of those things, all the interventions that you use. The data is the data that we use to measure progress toward our goals. And then our practices are the decision rules that the systems are the decision rules we use to decide what practices are going to be in place. So within ASD, when we think about this, we want to think about what would be the practices that we would use and how would we have those fit into a tiered system of support that we could progress monitor across all 3 tiers systematically, and that we could have a system in place that provided the professional development necessary at each tier and to the right people, so that the practices that we want for outcomes for students are just as available at each tier as they are for any other student. So what does this really mean? We have lists of evidence-based practices in autism that come to us from the National Professional Development Center for Autism, different resources. We have many well-researched and documented evidence-based practices for autism. That's step 1. That, if you go back to this slide, well, hold on, is your resource mapping. When you think about all the things that we have and you look at those long lists, our next step, come back with me to this slide, is to think about where might they belong on a tiered system of support. So let's think. Visual strategies, that might be Tier 1. Visual strategies are very analogous to universal design for learning. Visual strategies help English language learners, help students with autism, help students with low reading levels. Visual strategies are not an intervention unique to students with autism spectrum disorders, but they're of great benefit to students with autism spectrum disorders. So what does that mean for us? If visual strategies are a Tier 1 intervention, we just got a great entry point to general education and for our students having access to the supports that they need across every location because it's universal Tier 1. So what that means for our staff development and our professional development is visual strategies are no longer something that are just for autism teachers or autism specialists, but they might in fact be a Tier 1 intervention that benefits all. Let's take another one. FBA. Woo! That's probably a Tier 3. Those of us who've been through FBA training, that's pretty complex. There's a lot of really critical components for fidelity with an FBA. We don't want people thinking they can do an FBA who haven't really been fully trained, had practice opportunities, received their own progress monitoring, and we're sure that they are well equipped to complete that. So we do need to provide some very specialized professional learning opportunities around the FBA. But when we look at where it is on the tier, that may not be training that everybody needs. It may not be something that every staff person needs to excel in, as long as there is someone, when we look at our resource allocation, that is available to do that. What does that mean when we think about our way of work? Remember, VTSS is about efficiency and effectiveness. We start to look at our resources, including our human personnel resources, and determine what training needs to be done where and with whom. Let's take another one. ABI stands for antecedent-based interventions. When I'm going over these examples, it's important to clarify that there isn't a right or a wrong answer. You may have reasons that you would place an evidence-based practice at a different place in the tier. What's important is that you do the thinking and the reflection and the decision making. Because if you decide that antecedent-based interventions, things like wait time, pre-corrections, prompting, are really Tier 1, then when you think about your professional learning and supporting staff, that means that's something everybody's got to learn, because that's something everybody's got to do, because it's got to be available to all students everywhere all the time. If you think, no, antecedent-based interventions, I don't know, people can really mess up prompting, and if we start treating it like that's something that everybody can do without much training, they can misuse it and do more damage than good. Then you might want to think of that more as a Tier 2 intervention, or you might really want to tease out, okay, what are those antecedent-based interventions? Wait time? Definitely Tier 1. Everybody needs to understand wait time and processing. Prompting? I don't know. I think that's a little bit more specialized, and we need to consider that a Tier 2 intervention. The end result is not getting the answers correct, getting the sort in the right places. It's the thought process that goes into it so that your work can integrate with the work of your colleagues all across your building, all across your division, and that you are approaching things in the same way. That you can discuss what are Tier 1 interventions, what are Tier 2 interventions, and what are Tier 3 interventions, and what are the decision rules that led you to sort them that way. Video modeling, great evidence-based practice, great benefit to a lot of students, time intensive, and requires some skills. That would probably be in the advanced tiers, either Tier 2 or Tier 3. More likely Tier 2, because a lot of the video modeling can be used for more than one student, groups of students. But we know that it takes time to make, and we know that it requires some special training. So the Tier 1 intervention might simply be modeling, but a Tier 2 intervention might be video modeling, because we know that the closer the model is to the learner, the more likely learning is to take place. So we might want to finesse the modeling that we're doing in Tier 1 into this specialized Tier 2 strategy. And finally, another example is exercise. Definite Tier 1 strategy that all students can benefit from, but how great for those of us who are involved in education of students with autism to be able to bring that to the Tier 1 framework and say, let's try this. So the outcome that I'd like you to consider is this is the National Professional Development Center's list of evidence-based practices for autism spectrum disorders. What would be beneficial for you to do is to go through this list, take a look at the descriptions of the practice, take a look at the fidelity tools, the implementation tools, and determine what might be Tier 1 interventions, what might be Tier 2 interventions, what might be Tier 3 interventions. And then think how you can organize what professional learning you need or what professional learning you might need to offer others in order to assure that you've got a healthy framework to support your learners. The list is extensive, but it can be found at the NPDC website, and these are listed for your convenience if you come back to the PowerPoint. This is a good activity to do with others, to hear their reasoning and decision-making roles of why they put certain practices in which tier. But when you finish, what will be really helpful to you is to know specifically what evidence-based practices do you believe are part of core instruction. Because one of the things that we're challenged with our supports for learners with ASD is students who receive the bulk of their education in the general education setting, because we know that they have sometimes the ability but not the supports that allow them to show what they know. So if we can identify what are these core universal practices that are important for all students, and in most cases all learners with ASD, that we would want to see in place. Might be reinforcement. Could it be antecedent-based interventions? Maybe self-management, visual supports, systematic instruction? What are your ideas? Thanks to ACE, they've done some of this thinking for us. A while back, they identified the Foundational Five. It's there based on what they've observed in different programs and different classrooms. These 5 practices, when they are in place with fidelity, lead to significant good outcomes for students. So with the work that ACE has done prioritizing, if these become our core, and this is where we focus our professional development and implementation, we can be sure, from what the research tells us about our framework, that 80% of our students are going to meet benchmarks. That if these practices are in place, we're going to have an instructional environment where students can learn and thrive. More information on this is found at the website listed on the bottom on the VCU ACE fact sheet. So what is our challenge? We want to grow the green. We want to use evidence-based practices, such as the Foundational Five identified by ACE, to be Tier 1 supports for all students. We want to make sure that these practices are aligned with what all students are getting, that we're progress monitoring frequently, and that we're evaluating their impact. We're looking at if we're implementing with fidelity so that we can know that the strength of our core is strong and that the biggest effort that we are putting in is in the green, is in this core. So when we do that, we want to make sure that the interventions that we're using are an instructional match. It might be that beyond the Foundational Five, there is another EBP that's essential for a student's progress. We need to be aware of all the interventions, and if we can map them out in this tiered framework, it helps us do our planning and matching for student need. And most importantly, it helps us target our professional development, both what students needs and staff needs. So ASD and a multi-tiered systems of supports, to sum up, the way of work in Virginia is that we are serving all students to assure that they have access to the curriculum. The way that we do that is through tiered systems of supports, and when we do it well, we can be assured that all students meet benchmarks. With this common vocabulary and common language of the way of work, those who are supporting students with autism should be fully integrated and be able to advocate and include the evidence-based practices that students with autism need within this framework. So now I'd like you to think about, what did you learn? If someone asks you, what is VTSS? Can you answer that question? If someone asks you, what is that three-circle logic? Hint, hint, systems data practices. And why is it important? What might be your answer? And most importantly, I hope that you're able to answer, where and how do students with ASD fit into a multi-tiered system of supports? Thank you for the opportunity to share this with you this afternoon. I hope that if you have questions, you might visit any of these websites to learn more. In addition, there will be a web board posted for your questions that you can ask specifically, and those will be shared with me, and I'll be glad to get back to you. And I appreciate your time and hope this was a good learning experience for all of you. Thank you.